now you should see my presentation, and basically where it's about like completely different industry than the previous speakers were. And you might think that, oh my God, what's the automotive has to do with the data? But I completely agree with the first panelist that every business, especially the digital ones, are the data-driven and data-enabled businesses. And we applying this data-driven approach into automotive trade industry is something I would say very novel and interesting from this perspective. Whenever I kind of introduce myself and I talk to people that I work with technologies and the cars, of course, I receive the first thing that comes in mind, people like, oh my God, you're doing this self-driving cars or some sensory, artificially, I don't know, flying saucers and etc. And are you kind of in this direction? Or at the end, like, I don't know, electric motors and the mobility and etc. But whenever I kind of like focus on and narrow down that I'm doing the car trade, everyone's like, oh my God, you're a dealer. Which is like, which is kind of funny on one side, because we do are kind of in a dealership business, but from our technology perspective. And why cars overall, and why it's very interesting to give you a brief background, I'll give you kind of a little summary of the industry overall. If you look at the industry overall, you're going to see that it's the most undigital, it's the most physically demanded business operation in the world. Another one is that cars itself and car trade has become the second largest asset, at least it was before all this kind of crisis and all this stuff happened around us. It was the second largest traded asset cross-border between the countries after crude oil and gas. So there's like gas and oil, and there's like around $2.5 trillion of annual revenue for the car industry. And especially cars became our focus because we've noticed that there is kind of a specific pattern of cross-border used car trade, where you have these high-income countries exporting their used cars to low-income ones. And especially the people who are now from Georgia or Eastern Europe, you're going to see that itself, the industry has become a crucial part of our economies. So cars have become something that even your neighbors are trying to deal on, especially in Georgia. And on the Georgians example, right? So it has become the second largest thing for the economy. So it's the number second item in terms of export and re-export. And very shortly, like what we do is that our technology basically enables to bring the connectivity as a platform between all the businesses that are involved in the cross-border trade industry. These are the dealerships that are trying to sell their cars, online marketplaces where you see kind of car listings and to participate in the auctions, some logistical transportation partners, or even the leasing and fintech companies. So we like a protocol and technology that basically connect them and makes them to exchange information and kind of streamline the purchase process completely online from one country to another. So if you look from this structure perspective, you're going to see that we're dealing with huge amount of data, because all these businesses exchanging information between each other, that's like a lot of interactions that we basically sell. But what's more tricky from the data management perspective is that our technology does the entire coordination in the industry in a distributed manner. So that means that every business there is, like a dealership or the online marketplaces or the transportation companies, these are separate infrastructures, separate databases, separate individual businesses around the world. And we're basically coordinating, so they're exchanging the information between each other into peer-to-peer manner. So it's like a Tor network. So you don't have a single database or a single point where the entire data is aggregated. And in a way, everyone understands each other because there's a kind of indexing built in. So whenever I want to retrieve the pictures of a particular car to remarket and resale, I basically have an indexing, and I can retrieve it from a database that is owned and operated by a completely different business. So this is what we do. But overall, looking at the structure of and the amount of data that traveled between those businesses, we understood that we were having the largest industry picture of business to customer interaction than anyone had, even the participants on the network. So what we understood that while dealing with this type of big data and raw data, you might come up with a lot of ideas what you can build out of it and what could be like the final product, or like build the applications on top of it, or start analyzing. But there's a kind of a tricky part with these data-enabled businesses, especially, that you might come up with, like, I don't know, super beautiful visualization, or you might come up with kind of strange correlations of predictability, or build, I don't know, Skynet within all those data and structures. But in the end, it always comes to a regular user that should use, and the outcome of it, it should be a kind of finalization of the purchase and the trade process. So this is the kind of purpose. So not to make that mistake like most of the businesses do, that they build and start doing something, and then they move into asking customers and the questions, does it really bring say any type of value? So what I did was that from day one, I brought this picture of this particular guy in the office. This is the real guy with this real profession, Romeo. He's a kind of distant friend of mine who has been in the car trade business for years. So it is part of his life. So for the past 10 years, this guy, what he does, I don't know, buys, sells, imports, re-exports, and doing all the type of activities a normal trader does with the cars. And we had the kind of straightforward mission that I said to my team that we need to make the Romeo's knowledge accessible to everyone through data. So the idea was that, so you as a person who have zero background in understanding the car trades or any information around the cars of pricing, cost structures, and etc., we would make you able to take on his job in the shortest period of time possible. So this was our first kind of challenge that we did. And to reach that kind of knowledge accessibility of Romeo, of course, we needed to understand and analyze the inventory itself and the value formation within the network. What we realized was that our network basically transacts and auctions around 500,000 cars every month. So it's kind of 500,000 for value formation, cost structures, understandings on individual items that Romeo previously had a kind of exclusive knowledge of understanding how much to pay. Is it a good car? Is it a bad one? Or how much does it kind of cost to bring from one point to another? So this is kind of exclusivity that Romeo had, and we were trying to kind of democratize this field. So first step we took was that we started analyzing that each car, the used car, it has a specificity that people tend to buy, even in Georgia and Eastern Europe, tend to buy the damaged cars due to the low price, due to the low demand. So we needed to find out the correlation and understand the damages on the picture of each car had, and from the external databases, different condition reports, and run out through the different, say, around like 5 million per each model sales results to bring a kind of a predictability in terms of auction and the price outcomes. And the results, I would say, were pretty impressive, because we didn't really thought about it from this perspective, but what we achieved for a short time and what I'm really proud of is that in a way we democratizes this industry and the access. Because as you know, like cars especially, and especially car trade, it's like super male dominated industry. It's like, I don't know, testosterone flowing out of it. So you don't have many women and girls like really participating in it. And suddenly, by making this artificial Romeo and his knowledge accessible through data, what started is that now on our network marketplaces, who are part of our trade infrastructure and system, so you're going to see a lot of young girls, I would say with 10 times more enthusiasm, providing this consultation and sales process. And they're holding these tools and the access to the previously kind of knowledge that was exclusive and, in my opinion, biased by most of the men dealers. And there has been like a success that I kind of proud of as of my team. But overall, like having this type of knowledge accessible by data is only first steps towards the product formation. So we understood that by opening up this knowledge and interactions, we had to move towards the product. And of course, the first product we came up with was linked with the fintech and the leasing of these vehicles. To give you a kind of a very simple understanding, what does it mean? So we needed to make this algorithmic artificial Romeo knowledge accessible to every network participant, so they would use this information based on their business needs or based on the assessments. And for leasing companies, it was basically adding the Romeo's knowledge, some risk assessment tools, so that every time a leasing company has to credit someone or issue a loan, it has a good understanding of value formation and the cost formation for a particular asset, to lease it and to credit it over it. And of course, like I remember the first time we had like talks with banks and financial institutions, and always it was the same process, that they would have a special guys department or a special, I don't know, the gut type of guy who would come out, and he had this kind of knowledge of risk assessment, evaluation. These were the guys, in my opinion, with a very biased knowledge, because they don't have access to any data. It was all based on the experience, on subjective understanding, or even like scrolling sometimes to understand the internal pricing of a particular asset. And this kind of subjectivity is something that we're trying to eradicate within the industry. And of course, like the next day, the first thing I did was to bring another picture of this guy in the office, and to say that, okay, we're now going to start disseminating, cloning this guy and whatever he does in the most data-enabled and effective way possible. So yeah, and in a way, that was the kind of second direction we're moving towards that. And this is something that we're launching in a process of development. But overall, like whatever we describe from the data management perspective on creation of the knowledge, I still think that is very raw from the customer perspective. And I think that it's kind of detached most of the talks about data and this analysis from the real world application. So to kind of balance that out, what we are doing on the customer side is the kind of project that I call Rajdebaji. This is something I've dedicated my entire parenting time. It is basically all these data enabled risk assessments and all the kind of cost formation, but wrapped from the customer perspective. What we've learned that in most cases, yeah, you might come up a very close to subjective reality in terms of asset trade or even a streamlined entire process. But at the end of the day, it's very hard for a regular user who's just trying to buy a car and doesn't even care where this car is. It just needs to understand the process and the cost as simply as possible. And to translate and wrap this entire structures that's happening in the back into a user-friendly and understandable thing, we are launching this product, and I actually launched it today as a kind of demo for you to tap in. It's called Rajdebaji, which in Georgian means how much does it cost? .ge, and it's a very simple on one hand, so people like it answers the basic question that a final customer has, and that has to kind of transfer into and convert into a final purchase process. All the leasing companies and the marketplaces and the sellers, they are part of our network. So it's a very simple flow where people choose the specific vehicle, specific model, specific year, and suddenly in the back there's like a cooperation between the logistical companies, specific sellers, damage-based, price-based, year-based, engine-based, the evaluation of the cost formation, and providing just the simple pricing for a specific asset. But the process forming into the product moves into the risk assessment part, which is of course like in collaboration with the leasing companies that provides all the kind of streamed flow of you for applying the specific leasing, and all this data is provided with your own data as a buyer, where then the assessment process starts based on your credit history, the KYC measures, and etc. And it's a kind of entire streamlined process in a very simple terms translated to the final buyer that would of course should convert into a purchase. And this is the kind of field we're moving within this data. And I do believe that overall practice of working with these huge data structures, whatever business you are, right? On one side, especially with the networks that we are building, on one side, it should serve, this technology and data should serve like two purposes, right? The one side, from the service provision perspective, it would really provide the easy access to jobs. And whatever we did with data and like the women's involvement in the field, this is something we're really proud of and didn't expect it to happen. But on the other hand, from the buyer's perspective, it should like provide a very short and easy way of decision making. And it's the end, both parts, it translates to a very simple interactions from the seller and the buyer perspective. And it just mimics whatever we're building, the trust, the formation, and the knowledge that exists with this Romeo, the dealer that we have. And we're just trying to bring in to a more subjective, objective level, and with more efficiency due to cooperation in the network. So this is what we do with data. This is what we do with our network. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I guess now if you have any questions or anything.
Thank you, Lasha, very much. In the Q&A sections, we do not have questions. There is just one comment that Rajdeva.g, that's a cool idea. Good luck. So I would ask you this question. What do you think, what is the future of the global trade, not only cars, especially with this like recent developments, if you could like share with your from your perspective. And someone is asking if we can ask questions here. Yes, Q&A section is exactly for asking the questions, so please use this section and send your questions.
I should answer your question first, right?
Yes, Lasha.
Yeah. Your question regarding the overall e-commerce, I think that now this pandemic, everyone talks about like changing the entire landscape and moving online, but it will happen. So it will become a kind of as well, in some cases, primary source of sell and purchase, but it will never be able to completely replace the physical world of buying and selling and the distribution channels. So in my opinion, at first phase, in terms of bringing the global e-commerce, it's about like bringing exactly the connectivity between the different parts. So you can't have just an online experience of purchase and process without the logistical infrastructure, without the payment infrastructure, without the existing the kind of cross-border nature of regulations of goods and moving from one place to another. So it's not something like taking online would solve all these problems, but you need to understand that those infrastructures are fundamental in terms of growing into a global collaboration. And this is something that we're trying to do with the cars, bringing this collaboration.
Yes, and the team is asking if you could explain more about the reason why you do not aggregate the data in one place, why you should not do that.
Yeah, but so thing is that as you understand the data in our case, so all the data is dynamic. So it gets all the infrastructure that, for example, dealerships are holding. It's linked with their I don't know customer CRMs, with their inventory management systems. So it always gets updated, and it's like separate systems and the businesses. In one case, we could have started aggregated in a single database and started to kind of duplicate all the processes, but that's a waste of energy, time, and in our case, because then we needed to duplicate and like go and request all the information from different sellers and vendors, and then we would serve as a single source of truth in the network. That was something we didn't really want it to do. So as those databases infrastructures were already separate from businesses and databases, the best way we thought was to deal with it into torrent network and bringing in the elements of the blockchain as well, which in this torrent networks brings the integrity of each vehicle data. So no matter which copy you're retrieving from another your peer, you understand that was the real state of a particular asset and item in the trade process. And it's better from the scalability perspective as well, because when you don't limit anyone connecting to the network by plugging into a certain database, but you just provide a protocol as a standard, it works like GSM system. You're not telling everyone what type of mobile phone to use, but you're just telling them this is the GSM standard, so use whatever device you want, but you're going to be part of this entire interactions. And I personally, I believe this kind of network effects. I believe in kind of distributed interactions, and this is something I've been very enthusiastic in terms of building. And yeah, that's the reason.
Amazing. We have one more question. The biggest challenge for getting involved in big data is the huge social and monetary capital that it requires. What advice could you give to better manage the associated capital?
That means, if I understand the question correctly, you're asking that to involve in a kind of big data industry, that's a kind of huge barrier in terms of capital entry. Is it correct?
Well, I think the attendee meant that. Yes, yes.
In terms of that, I think that monetary capital, true. I don't quite understand the first part of the question, which means like huge social capital required. I would say I don't understand what the social capital means, because if you want to deal with it, if you want to do something good out of it, it's more of like, for me, it's an individual capital required for start doing something, and they create a kind of social pressure around it, like the previous talkers and the afterwards talkers gonna do. So I believe this entire capital, starting off from individualism and spreading into networks of collaboration. In terms of capital, yes, first, there's a kind of tricky part, because yeah, when people start talking about big data and all these kinds of structures, most of the scientists, especially, this like things they use these buzzwords to make you not go into the industry. It's like barriers for them not to have a competition high. But I think that from data perspective, you can start working and make your first steps even on the simplest interactions between two individuals or two businesses, and etc. And there's always a room for improvement. And there's always a room for analysis. There's always a room for building a larger picture and the interactions.